Hello there, and welcome back to Mad Art. Now think back to your school days. Remember those history and civics lessons? The smell of chalk dust, the slightly too enthusiastic teacher, and the comforting stories of heroic figures and unwavering national ideals. It was all very neat, wasn't it? A bit too neat, perhaps. Almost as if someone carefully curated the national story to be as palatable as a lukewarm slice of apple pie served at a 4th of July picnic. Well, tonight we're going to add a bit of much-needed spice to that pie, and by spice I mean the uncomfortable, often infuriating truth. Today, we're uncovering the top 10 political lies you were taught in school. And look, this isn't about blaming your third-grade teacher, Mrs. Gable, who was just trying to get through the day without a nervous breakdown. This is about the grand, sweeping narratives that shape our understanding of the world. Narratives that often sand down the jagged edges of history until it's smooth, shiny, and fundamentally misleading. We're going to take a closer look at the stories that were handed down to us, the ones that became the bedrock of our political knowledge. So, grab a notebook, maybe a stiff drink, because this might get a little bumpy. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew about history and politics. We're peeling back the layers of patriotic myth-making to get to the messy, complicated, and frankly, far more interesting reality. We're going to exhume some historical skeletons, and trust me, the closets are absolutely packed. It's time to unlearn and relearn. Let's get into it. Right, let's start at the very beginning with the guys in wigs. We were all taught that the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, were these enlightened demigods who bravely forged a government of the people, by the people, for the people. The story goes that they wanted a true democracy where every voice mattered equally. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? It conjures images of earnest farmers in town halls, all having a say in their collective destiny. It's also, and I say this with the utmost respect for their powdered periwigs, absolute nonsense. The truth is, many of the founding fathers were deeply, deeply suspicious of direct democracy. They were terrified of what they called mob rule. John Adams, for instance, once wrote that pure democracy would commit suicide. They looked at the idea of the general public making major decisions and thought, oh heavens no, have you met these people? They'll vote to cancel taxes and make beer the national currency. They were wealthy, educated landowners, and they were genuinely worried that the uneducated, property-less masses would vote to take away their stuff. And to be fair, they might have had a point. So, what did they build instead? A republic. And that's a key distinction. They designed a system of filters, of checks and balances specifically to slow things down and keep the popular will at a comfortable arm's length. Think about it, the Electoral College, which can and has overridden the popular vote. Senators were originally chosen by state legislatures, not by the people directly. The entire structure was a complex machine designed to buffer the government from the passions of the public. They wanted a government run by the better sort of people, which, coincidentally, was them. This wasn't some accidental oversight, it was intentional design. They were creating a system where power was held by representatives who they hoped would be wiser and more dispassionate than the general population. They feared that a pure democracy would be too volatile, too susceptible to short-term whims and demagoguery. They saw it as a stepping stone to tyranny, not the ultimate form of freedom. So they created a representative republic, a system that mediates the will of the people through elected officials. So, the next time you hear a politician waxing lyrical about how the founders wanted a pure democracy, you can gently remind them that what they actually wanted was a carefully engineered republic designed to prevent the mob from running amok. They weren't building a free-for-all town hall. They were building a very exclusive, very deliberate gentleman's club with a very, very strict door policy. The idea of power to the people came much, much later, and it was fought for, not gifted. Ah, the states' rights argument. This is the historical equivalent of saying you're passionate about synergy in a job interview. It's a vague, clean-sounding euphemism for something much, much uglier. For generations, students, particularly in the South, were taught that the American Civil War was a noble conflict fought over the principle of states' rights versus a tyrannical federal government. It was a war of northern aggression, they said, a philosophical debate about constitutional interpretation. This narrative is as persistent as it is poisonous. Let's be unequivocally, painfully clear here. The Civil War was about slavery. Full stop. How do we know? Because the people who started the war told us so, repeatedly and explicitly. You don't even need to read between the lines. The lines themselves are giant, blinking, neon signs that say, slavery. When Southern states seceded from the Union, they published their own declarations of causes, and guess what the primary cause was? Spoiler alert, it wasn't tariffs or a deep-seated love for decentralized government. Let's take Mississippi's declaration for example. It states, and I quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Not exactly subtle, is it? It's like a breakup letter that says, it's not me, it's you, and specifically, it's your refusal to let me continue to own other human beings as property. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, gave a whole speech, the Cornerstone Speech, where he declared that the new government's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. The states' rights argument was a post-war rebranding effort, a marketing campaign concocted by former Confederates to retroactively dignify their failed rebellion. It was a way to scrub the moral stain of their cause and reframe it as a heroic struggle for liberty. It's an incredibly effective piece of propaganda that has seeped into textbooks and public consciousness for over a century. It allows people to honor Confederate heritage without having to grapple with the horrific reality of what that heritage was built on. So, yes, the Confederate states were fighting for a states' right, specifically, the right to own people. The right to build an entire economy on the brutal exploitation of human chattel. The right to expand that system into new territories. To pretend it was about anything else is to willfully ignore the mountain of evidence they themselves provided. It's not a debate. It's a settled fact that has been deliberately obscured by a century-long campaign of historical revisionism. Okay, let's talk about the man who has a national holiday, several cities, and a whole Ivy League university named after him, despite having the navigational skills of a drunk pigeon. The story we all got in kindergarten was simple. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, discovered a new world, and proved the earth was round. It's a tidy little nursery rhyme that paints him as a heroic, visionary explorer. The only problem is that almost every part of that sentence is wrong. First, the most glaringly obvious point. You cannot discover a place where millions of people already live. It's like me discovering your living room while you're sitting on the couch watching TV. The Americas were already home to complex, thriving civilizations with their own cultures, languages, and histories stretching back thousands of years. The Taino, the Aztecs, the Inca, the countless tribes across North America, they didn't need discovering, thank you very much, they were doing just fine. What Columbus did was initiate a catastrophic collision of worlds. Second, Columbus never even set foot on the mainland of what would become the United States. His voyages took him to the Caribbean islands, Hispaniola, Cuba, the Bahamas. He died believing he had found a new route to Asia, which is why he incorrectly labeled the indigenous people Indians. He was not just wrong, he was stubbornly, monumentally wrong, until the very end. The man was a testament to failing upwards on a truly global scale. And let's not sugarcoat the nature of his arrival. The story of Columbus is not one of peaceful exchange and discovery. It's a story of brutal conquest, enslavement, and genocide. His own journals and the accounts of his contemporaries detail a horrifying campaign of violence against the native Taino people. He established a tribute system where natives were forced to supply gold, and those who failed had their hands cut off. He initiated the transatlantic slave trade. This wasn't a cultural exchange program, it was the beginning of a Holocaust. So why do we cling to this myth? It's a foundation story. It creates a clean starting point for American history, one that conveniently erases the existence and subsequent destruction of the people who were here first. It frames the story of America as one of European ingenuity and bravery, rather than one of violent colonization. Celebrating Columbus as the discoverer of America is like celebrating an asteroid for discovering the dinosaurs. It was a monumental event, sure, but it wasn't exactly great news for the locals. The Boston Tea Party. It's one of the most iconic moments of the American Revolution, right? The image is seared into our minds. A bunch of plucky colonists, dressed as Native Americans for reasons, defiantly dumping tea into Boston Harbor. The story we're told is that they were furious about the high price of tea. King George raised the taxes, the colonists got mad, and splash, tea goes into the water. It's a simple, relatable story of fiscal outrage. I mean, who doesn't hate high taxes? But that story misses the entire point. It wasn't about the price of tea. In fact, the Tea Act of 1773 actually made the British East India Company's tea cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea most colonists were drinking. Yes, you heard that right. The tea they threw into the harbor was the budget-friendly option. This wasn't a consumer revolt against high prices, it was a political protest against a corporate bailout and a violation of their rights. The real issue was the principle behind the tax. The Tea Act gave the struggling British East India Company a monopoly on the American tea trade and allowed them to sell directly to the colonies, cutting out colonial merchants. And crucially, it kept in place a small, symbolic tax, the Townshend duty, that the colonists had been protesting for years. The core of the problem wasn't the cost, it was the fact that Parliament was imposing a tax, any tax, on them without their consent. This was about the fundamental principle of no taxation without representation. The colonists believed that only their own elected assemblies had the right to tax them. By accepting this cheap tax tea, they would be implicitly accepting Parliament's right to govern them from across an ocean. They saw it as a Trojan horse. Sure, the tea is cheap now, but once you accept the premise that a distant government can tax you, what comes next? It was a line in the sand. So, the Boston Tea Party wasn't a bunch of grumpy cheapskates. It was a highly organized act of political defiance against what they saw as government overreach and corporate cronyism. They were protesting the monopoly granted to a politically connected megacorporation and the dangerous precedent of being taxed by a government in which they had no voice. It's a far more complex and frankly more relevant story than a simple tantrum over prices. It was about who holds the power to tax and govern. There is a powerful and pervasive myth that the United States has always been a global champion of freedom and democracy. A shining city on a hill, as Reagan put it, acting as a beacon of liberty for the rest of the world. We see ourselves as the good guys, the cavalry riding in to save the day from despots and dictators. This narrative is a cornerstone of American exceptionalism, and honestly it feels good to believe. It's also demonstrably and at times tragically false. Throughout the 20th century, particularly during the Cold War, the United States had a rather flexible definition of freedom. The primary goal was not promoting democracy, it was combating communism. And if that meant propping up a brutal, anti-democratic dictator who just happened to be on our side, well, that was a price the US government was more than willing to pay. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if my friend is a murderous tyrant who dissolves parliament and tortures dissidents. The list of US-backed dictatorships is long and deeply uncomfortable. There was Augusto Pinochet in Chile, whose bloody 1973 coup against a democratically elected socialist government was supported by the CIA. There was the Shah of Iran, an autocrat put back on his throne in a 1953 coup orchestrated by the US and Britain. We supported Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, and a whole host of military juntas in Latin America. These weren't champions of liberty, they were our guys, and their primary qualification was being anti-Soviet. This wasn't just about turning a blind eye, it often involved active interference. The CIA has a long and storied history of covert operations aimed at overthrowing democratically elected governments that were deemed unfriendly to US interests. From Guatemala in 1954 to Congo in 1960, the pursuit of strategic advantage frequently trumped any commitment to democratic principles. The freedom we were exporting often looked a lot like installing a regime that would be favorable to American corporations and hostile to the Soviet Union. This doesn't mean the US has never done anything good on the world stage, but it does shatter the simplistic myth of a purely altruistic foreign policy. The reality is far more pragmatic, and often far more cynical. National interest, economic motives, and geopolitical strategy have consistently been the driving forces, and the ideals of freedom and democracy have often been convenient justifications rather than genuine goals. The world is complicated, and America's role in it has been far messier than the heroic bedtime story we tell ourselves. The American Dream. It's the most powerful marketing slogan in our nation's history. The idea that anyone, regardless of their background, can achieve success through hard work, determination, and a little bit of grit. It's the story of the penniless immigrant who becomes a millionaire, the kid from the wrong side of the tracks who becomes president. It's a beautiful, inspiring narrative of limitless opportunity, and for some, it has even been true. But to say it's equally accessible to everyone is a cruel and misleading lie. This pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality completely ignores the fact that for much of American history, huge segments of the population weren't even given boots. For centuries, systemic barriers were deliberately constructed to lock people out of the dream based on their race, gender, or origin. You can't talk about equal opportunity without talking about the legacy of slavery, which didn't just end in 1865. It was followed by a century of Jim Crow laws, segregation, and state-sanctioned terror that systematically denied Black Americans access to education, housing, political power, and wealth creation. Think about the policies that built the American middle class in the 20th century. The GI Bill was a revolutionary piece of legislation that provided veterans with low-cost mortgages and college tuition. It was fantastic. Unless you were a Black veteran, in which case you were often denied these benefits by racist local administrators. Federal housing policies actively promoted segregation through redlining, a practice where neighborhoods with minority residents were deemed hazardous for investment, effectively locking them out of the primary engine of middle-class wealth homeownership. These aren't ancient historical footnotes, their effects ripple through generations. Wealth is cumulative. When one generation is denied the ability to buy a home, save money, or get an education, the next generation starts at a massive disadvantage. The starting line isn't the same for everyone. Some people start the race 100 meters ahead, while others start with their ankles chained together. To look at the person who is still at the starting line and say, "Why aren't you running faster?" is to be willfully blind to the obstacles placed in their path. The American dream is a powerful ideal to strive for, but pretending it's a reality for everyone is a form of gaslighting. It allows us to blame individuals for systemic failures. It turns a blind eye to the deep-seated inequalities that are baked into the very structure of our society. Acknowledging these barriers isn't about diminishing the success of those who've made it. It's about being honest about the fact that the game has been, and in many ways continues to be, rigged. We tend to talk about the Constitution in hushed, reverent tones as if it were a holy relic handed down from on high. Politicians clutch pocket-sized copies of it to their chests like talismans. We treat it as a fixed, immutable document, a perfect blueprint for governance that should be interpreted exactly as the founders intended. But honestly, this idea of a static, unchangeable constitution is not only wrong, but it also betrays the very genius of the document itself. The founders were smart guys, but they weren't prophets. They knew they couldn't possibly foresee all the challenges a new nation would face. I mean, they were creating a government in a world of horse-drawn carriages and quill pens. They had no concept of the internet, automatic weapons, or corporations with budgets larger than most countries. So, to believe they wrote a document that could perfectly address every 21st century issue without any need for updates is frankly absurd. And that's why they gave us the ultimate edit button, the amendment process. Article 5 of the Constitution is a built-in acknowledgement that the document is imperfect and would need to evolve over time. It's a feature, not a bug. The ability to amend the Constitution is what has allowed it to endure for over 200 years. It's what allowed us to correct some of the founders' most glaring and, frankly, morally reprehensible blind spots. Think about the most fundamental rights we take for granted today. The end of slavery, that's the 13th Amendment. The guarantee of equal protection under the law, the 14th Amendment. The right of women to vote, that's the 19th Amendment. The right of 18-year-olds to vote, the 26th Amendment. Our modern understanding of American freedom is built not just on the original text, but on the changes we have made to it. The Constitution is a living document, not a fossil encased in amber. So this idea of originalism, the belief that we must adhere strictly to the original intent of the 18th century authors, is a deeply flawed and often politically motivated concept. It freezes the Constitution in time and ignores the dynamic, messy, and ongoing process of struggle and debate that has shaped it. The Constitution isn't a sacred text to be worshipped. It's a framework for governance that was designed to be argued over, challenged, and when necessary, changed. Its durability comes from its flexibility, not its rigidity. Ah, the melting pot. It's such a comforting metaphor, isn't it? It suggests that people from all over the world can come to America, and all their cultural differences will seamlessly blend together into one beautiful, homogeneous, and distinctly American stew. Everyone contributes a little something, and out comes a perfectly unified national identity. It's a lovely sentiment, often taught in schools to illustrate the nation's immigrant heritage. but it's a metaphor that hides a much more complicated and often painful reality. For one thing, the melting process has never been particularly gentle. Historically, it has often meant that immigrant and minority groups were expected to shed their own cultures, languages, and traditions and assimilate into a dominant Anglo-Protestant norm. It wasn't a blend, it was a demand for conformity. Your flavor was welcome in the pot only if it didn't overpower the base broth. This pressure to assimilate, to abandon one's heritage in order to be considered truly American, has been a source of immense tension and loss for countless communities. Furthermore, the melting pot metaphor implies that everyone is treated equally in the process, which is patently false. The heat has always been applied unevenly. For centuries, laws and social norms explicitly prevented certain groups from ever melting in. The Chinese Exclusion Act, immigration quotas that favored Northern Europeans, the forced segregation of African Americans, the internment of Japanese Americans. These are not the actions of a nation committed to a harmonious blend. They are the actions of a nation actively deciding who belongs and who doesn't. A more accurate, though perhaps less appetizing metaphor, might be a salad bowl or a mosaic. In this model, different cultures coexist, contributing to the whole while retaining their own distinct identities. It acknowledges that you can be Irish American, Italian American, Mexican American, or Nigerian American and still be fully American. It suggests that diversity is a source of strength, not something to be boiled away until it's unrecognizable. Even this, however, can feel a bit too neat. The truth is, America's struggle with diversity is ongoing. We are still grappling with issues of systemic inequality, discrimination, and the legacy of a history where not everyone was invited to the potluck. Pretending we are a perfectly blended melting pot allows us to ignore these persistent racial and ethnic tensions. It's a feel-good story that papers over deep divisions and the continuous fight for true equality and recognition that many groups still face every single day. One person, one vote. It's the bedrock principle of a democratic society. We are taught that voting is a fundamental right, a sacred duty, and the primary way we participate in our government. The story often presented in schools is that once the nation was founded, this right was more or less established for its citizens. But the idea that voting has always been a universal right for all American citizens is a historical fantasy of the highest order. When the Constitution was ratified, the right to vote was anything but universal. It was almost exclusively the privilege of white male property owners, that's it. If you were a woman, a person of color, a Native American, or a man who didn't own enough land, you were completely shut out of the political process. The People in We the People was an incredibly exclusive club with a very short guest list. The history of voting rights in America is not a story of a right given, but of a right fought for, clawed for, and died for. The expansion of suffrage has been a long, brutal, and incremental battle. It took the 15th Amendment, after the Civil War, to grant black men the right to vote, a right that was then systematically stripped away for nearly a century through poll taxes, literacy tests, and violent intimidation under Jim Crow. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that this promise even began to be fulfilled. That's a 100-year gap, a full century of struggle. Meanwhile, women were fighting their own battle. The suffragist movement agitated for decades, facing ridicule, arrest, and violence. It took until 1920, with the passage of the 19th Amendment for women to finally win the right to vote nationwide. And even then, many women of color were still disenfranchised by the same racist tactics that targeted black men. Native Americans weren't even considered citizens until 1924, and many faced barriers to voting for decades after that. So the next time you see a picture of the Founding Fathers, remember that their vision of a voter was an incredibly narrow one. The democracy we have today, imperfect as it is, was built not by them alone, but by generations of activists, marchers, and rebels who demanded a seat at the table. The right to vote was never a gift from the powerful, it was seized by the powerless. And as recent events have shown, it's a right that is still contested and must be constantly defended. And finally, we arrive at the biggest, most comforting lie of all, that the government, our government, is fundamentally honest with us. We are taught to trust our institutions. We learn that government agencies are there to protect us and provide us with accurate information. It's the kind of foundational trust that's necessary for a society to function. It would also be incredibly naive to believe it's always true. The historical record is littered with examples of the US government deliberately misleading, deceiving, and outright lying to its own people. Let's take one of the most infamous examples: the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. The Johnson administration claimed that North Vietnamese patrol boats had launched an unprovoked attack against a US destroyer. This incident was used to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the president broad authority to escalate the war in Vietnam. The truth, which emerged years later, was that the second attack almost certainly never happened. It was a phantom event, a misreading of sonar that was spun into a pretext for a massive military escalation that cost over 58,000 American lives. Or how about the Tuskegee syphilis study? From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted an experiment on hundreds of impoverished African American men with syphilis. The men were told they were receiving free health care, but they were never told they had syphilis and were never given treatment, even after penicillin became the standard cure. The government researchers simply wanted to study the disease's progression. They lied to these men for 40 years as they suffered and died, all in the name of science. And it doesn't stop there. From the CIA's secret mind control experiments in Project MK-Ultra, to the Iran-Contra affair where the Reagan administration secretly sold arms to Iran to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua, to the false claims about weapons of mass destruction that led to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Time and time again, for reasons of national security, political expediency, or pure embarrassment, the government has chosen to conceal the truth from the public it's supposed to serve. This isn't to say that every government official is a liar, or that we should descend into paranoid conspiracy theories, but it is a powerful reminder that governments, like all powerful institutions, are capable of deception. A healthy democracy requires a skeptical citizenry. It requires us to question official narratives, to demand evidence, and to hold our leaders accountable. Trust is essential, but it must be earned, not blindly given. Assuming the government is always telling the truth isn't patriotism, it's an abdication of our responsibility as citizens. So, there you have it. 10 historical narratives that were, at best, oversimplified and at worst, deliberate distortions designed to create a more convenient, more heroic national story. From the Founding Fathers' fear of democracy to the ongoing struggle for true equality, the reality is always more complex, more challenging, and far more interesting than the myths we were taught. Unlearning these things can be uncomfortable. It can feel like the solid ground of your own history is shifting beneath your feet. But it's a necessary process if we want to have an honest conversation about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. History isn't a static collection of facts, it's an ongoing argument, and as we've seen, it's often the powerful who get to publish the first draft. Remember, history is written by the victors, so always question what you're taught. Dig deeper, read from different perspectives, and be skeptical of any story that sounds too simple or too good to be true. Critical thinking isn't just an academic exercise, it's a fundamental tool for citizenship. It's our best defense against manipulation, and our best path toward a more honest understanding of ourselves and our society. Thank you for joining me on this slightly disillusioning but hopefully enlightening journey. The conversation doesn't end here. What are some of the historical lies you were taught in school? Let us know in the comments below. If you learned something new, share this video and keep the conversation going. The more we question, the more we learn. Until next time, stay critical.